Mel Gibson discovered a shocking truth about Jesus in the Ethiopian Bible, and what he found did not destroy his faith. It deepened it in ways he never expected. But it also raised questions that the Western Church has never fully answered. Questions that have been sitting in an ancient text, in an ancient language, in an ancient Christian tradition that most of the modern world has never heard of, waiting for someone willing to look directly at them without flinching. Mel Gibson looked, and what he saw changed him. Let's get into it. Most people in the Western world think of the Bible as a single, settled, agreed-upon document. The Old Testament and the New Testament. 66 books, fixed, established. The canon closed centuries ago, and what is in it is what was always in it, and what was left out for good reasons by people with authority to make that call. That assumption is wrong, and the Ethiopian Bible proves it. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church is one of the oldest Christian institutions on earth. Christianity reached Ethiopia in the 4th century, roughly the same time it was becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine. But the Ethiopian Church did not develop under Roman influence. It developed independently, rooted in a much older Jewish tradition that had existed in Ethiopia for centuries before Christ, connected by ancient trade routes and diplomatic relationships to the Jerusalem of the First Temple period. The Ethiopian Church has its own liturgical language, Ge'ez, its own theological tradition, its own saints, its own understanding of Scripture, and it has its own Bible. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books. The Protestant Bible contains 66. The Catholic Bible contains 73. The Ethiopian canon includes texts that no other Christian tradition recognizes as Scripture, texts that were known in the ancient world, that were read and cited by early church fathers, that appear in ancient manuscript collections from across the Mediterranean, but that were excluded from the Western canon during the councils and controversies of the first few centuries of the Church's history. Among those texts is the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Shepherd of Hermas, the Ascension of Isaiah, books that Western Christians have never heard of, books that, if you grew up in any mainstream Protestant or Catholic tradition, you were never told existed. Books that contain material about angels, about the nature of heaven, about the cosmic history of the universe before human time, and about Jesus, that differs in significant ways from the portrait painted by the 4 canonical Gospels. This is what Mel Gibson encountered, and this is what stopped him cold. Gibson is not a casual religious observer. He is a traditional Latin Mass Catholic, a member of a strand of Catholicism that takes doctrine, history, and the precise details of theological tradition with extreme seriousness. He directed The Passion of the Christ in 2004, a film that depicted the final hours of Jesus with a level of graphic intensity and theological commitment that no Hollywood film had ever attempted. He researched that film for years. He read theology. He consulted scholars. He believed he understood the story he was telling. Then he encountered the Ethiopian tradition, and he found things he had not been told. The Book of Enoch is the starting point. In the canonical Bible, Enoch appears briefly in Genesis, a man who walked with God and was taken by God without dying. 7 generations from Adam, father of Methuselah. Gone in 2 verses. The Western tradition treats him as a minor figure, a footnote, a curiosity. The Ethiopian tradition treats him as a major prophet. And the Book of Enoch, which the Ethiopian Church, regards as Scripture, contains what purports to be his extended writings, his visions, his journeys through the heavens, his encounters with angels and with the divine presence itself. What is in the Book of Enoch that stopped Gibson? The first thing is the figure called the Son of Man. In the Gospels, Jesus refers to himself repeatedly as the Son of Man. It is his most frequently used self-designation. Scholars have debated for 2 centuries what he meant by it. Was it a humble self-reference, simply a way of saying a human being, a man? Was it an apocalyptic title drawn from the book of Daniel, where one like a son, a half-man comes with the clouds of heaven before the Ancient of Days and is given authority and glory and a kingdom? The debate has never been resolved in the Western scholarly tradition because the canonical texts do not give enough information to settle it definitively. The Book of Enoch gives more information, dramatically more. In the sections of Enoch known as the Similitudes, chapters 37 through 71, the Son of Man appears as a pre-existent heavenly figure. Not a human being who became divine, not a man elevated to God's right hand after death and resurrection, a being who existed before creation, who was named and chosen before the sun and the stars were made, who sits on a throne of glory, who will judge the living and the dead at the end of history, who is described in terms that are functionally identical to the terms the Gospel of John uses to describe Jesus, the Word who was in the beginning, who was with God, who was God. The Similitudes of Enoch were written before Jesus. Scholars date them to somewhere between 300 BCE and the 1st century CE, almost certainly before the ministry of Jesus began. and they contain a portrait of the Son of Man that maps almost perfectly onto the portrait of Jesus in the Gospel of John and in the letters of Paul. This means one of two things. Either the early followers of Jesus read the book of Enoch, recognized Jesus as the figure Enoch described, and shaped their own writings about him through the lens of that prior's tradition. Or the tradition Enoch recorded genuinely described something real about a heavenly figure who later appeared in history as Jesus of Nazareth. There is no third option that makes sense of the evidence. Gibson sat with that for a long time, because both options are significant. If the first is true, the Gospels are more deeply rooted in the apocalyptic Jewish literature of the Second Temple period than Western Christianity has ever fully acknowledged. The portrait of Jesus. This is not invented whole cloth, but developed from a pre-existing theological tradition that the Ethiopian church preserved and the Western church set aside. If the second is true, the implications are even more staggering. A prophet 7 generations from Adam saw something real about a being who would appear 2,000 years later, and wrote it down, and the Ethiopian church kept that writing in its Bible while the Western church quietly removed it from consideration. Either way, something important has been hidden, not deliberately suppressed in some conspiracy, but effectively invisible to anyone who only reads the Western canon. And Gibson, who had made an entire film about Jesus and believed he understood the source material, suddenly realized he had been working from an incomplete text. That realization was the first shock. The second came from the Book of Jubilees. The Book of Jubilees is another text the Ethiopian church regards as scripture. It retells the narrative of Genesis and Exodus in expanded form, providing details and koan text that the canonical text omits. And among the things it provides is a much more detailed account of the cosmic backstory of the biblical narrative. The nature and role of angels, the origin of evil, the structure of the heavens, the mechanics of how divine authority operates in the created world. In Jubilees, the angels are not background figures. They are active participants in the management of creation. They are assigned specific nations and peoples to oversee. They interact with human history in ways that are direct, physical, and consequential. And among the angels described is a figure Ca-led Mastema, the adversary, the accuser, who functions in a role that is clearly parallel to Satan in the canonical tradition, but whose authority and relationship to God is described in much more explicit terms. In the canonical Bible, the origin of evil is never fully explained. Satan appears, he tempts, he accuses, he destroys. But where he came from, how he acquired his power, why God permits his operation, these questions are answered only obliquely, if at all, in the Western canon. The Book of Jubilees addresses them directly, and what it says about the relationship between divine authority and the adversarial force in creation is more theologically complex than anything in the canonical texts. Gibson found in this not a contradiction of his faith, but a depth he had not previously accessed. The questions he had always had about the nature of evil, about why suffering exists in a world made by a good God, about the cosmic dimension of what Jesus was doing in his death and resurrection. Jubilees addressed those questions with a directness that the canonical texts approach only through implication. The theology of the atonement, why Jesus had to die, what his death accomplished in cosmic terms, is one of the most contested questions in Christian thought. The Western Church has produced multiple competing theories over 2,000 years. The substitutionary model, the moral influence model, the Christus Victor model, the idea that the death and resurrection of Jesus was fundamentally a battle, a cosmic conflict between divine power and the adversarial forces that had usurped authority over creation, ending in the decisive defeat of those forces and the liberation of humanity from their grip. The Christus Victor model is the oldest model. It dominated the theology of the early church before the Western tradition developed the substitutionary frameworks that now dominate Protestant theology. And it maps most naturally onto the world described in the Ethiopian canon, a world in which angels and adversarial powers are real actors in cosmic history, in which the battle between light and darkness is not merely metaphorical, in which the stakes of what Jesus did are not limited to the moral ledger of individual human sin, but extend to the entire structure of cosmic authority. Gibson made the passion of the Christ through the lens of substitutionary atonement, the suffering of Jesus bearing the weight of human sin. After encountering the Ethiopian tradition, he began to see a larger frame, not one that contradicted what he had believed, one that contained it. A frame in which the suffering was real and the substitution was real, but the meaning extended outward into a cosmic conflict that the canonical texts hint at but never fully describe. This is the thing that most shocked him, not that the Ethiopian Bible contradicted the Western Bible, but that it completed it in ways he had never been told were possible. And that raises the question that Gibson has not been able to stop asking since. Why were these books removed? The history of the biblical canon is not simple, and it is not clean. The texts that were included and the texts that were excluded were not sorted by a single authoritative council applying clear and objective criteria. The process was messier than that. Different communities had different canons. Different church fathers cited different texts as authoritative. The Book of Enoch was cited by the author of the New Testament letter of Jude. It is quoted directly by name in a canonical New Testament letter, and yet it was excluded from the canon while Jude was included. The Shepherd of Hermas was treated as scripture by major early church figures and then excluded. The process of canon formation extended over centuries, involved politics and geography and theological controversy, and ended differently in different traditions. The Ethiopian church simply made different decisions, and the decisions it made preserved texts that the Western church set aside, texts that contain material about Jesus, about the cosmic structure of the biblical world, about the nature of the Son of Man and the role of angels, and the mechanics of the conflict between good and evil, material that would not change the faith of if anyone who encountered it, but would deepen it, complicate it, extend it into dimensions that the Western canon alone cannot reach. Gibson came away from this encounter not as a man whose faith had been shaken, but as a man who understood for the first time that what he thought was the whole picture was a portion of a much larger image, that the tradition he belonged to had made choices, not conspiratorial choices, not dishonest choices, but historical choices with historical consequences, that had left significant portions of the ancient Christian witness outside the frame. And he began to understand the Ethiopian church differently, not as an exotic variant of real Christianity, as a custodian, a keeper of something that the Western tradition lost track of in the centuries of councils and controversies and empire, a community that, TT had held onto 81 books in an ancient language, in an ancient land while the rest of the Christian world argued over 66, and that had, in doing so, preserved a portrait of Jesus and of the cosmic story in which Jesus is the central figure that is richer, deeper, and more complete than anything the Western tradition reads on its own. That is what Mel Gibson found in the Ethiopian Bible. Not a different Jesus, the same Jesus, seen from a wider angle and a larger frame against a deeper background. A Jesus who was named before the stars were made, who was seen by a prophet 7 generations from Adam, who came into history to fight a battle whose stakes were not merely human but cosmic, who won that battle in a way that the Ethiopian tradition has always understood more clearly than the West. The shocking truth was not that something had been hidden. The shocking truth was that something had been preserved. Preserved in Ge'ez, in the ancient churches of the Ethiopian highlands, in a canon of 81 books that most Western Christians do not know exists. And it was waiting for someone willing to look at it honestly, someone with enough faith to not be threatened by what he found, someone who had spent his life trying to understand who Jesus really was and what he really did. Mel Gibson looked, and the Ethiopian Bible answered him in ways that 2,000 years of Western theology had not. That is not the end of a faith. That is the beginning of a deeper one.